And our last speaker is Professor Poonam Batra.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here on this panel. I think a very critical aspect that has been brought out as I hear all the speakers is probably the fact that we don't engage enough with diversity itself. I mean, we've been talking about the fact that, you know, teachers need to be less prejudiced and more aware, and we need to bring in students from different sections of society and make sure that our classrooms, our institutions are diverse. But what about the curriculum? In fact, it's been since 2005 NCF, which is school education curriculum, but just to flag the point, and I'll come to higher education, there was an attempt, a very, very robust attempt, to actually talk about diversity in the classroom, because I do not think that anyone, whether a student or a teacher, can understand marginalization, prejudice, discrimination, unless there is a deep understanding of diversity. And I think that understanding is a question of the content of curriculum. And here I'm not just talking about bringing in diverse voices and those hitherto excluded voices and their experiences, but I'm talking also about challenging disciplinary canons. I think that point came across in the previous presentation when you talk about how that boy had difficulty relating to the readings. So why is that so? Because let's not forget, I mean, no matter how much post-independence we have tried in India to be able to decolonize some of the higher education level knowledges, not school education at all, but only more recently. But we have, I mean, our social sciences has a body of knowledge which is decolonized, and I think we can be proud of that. But how much of that actually enters into school education? Very little. Because there is really no link that ought to be there between higher education and school education. That is one. The second is that a lot of the decolonized knowledges have at least flagged one major issue, which is that we need to develop our own ways of looking at our reality. We cannot depend solely on the canons of knowledges that have come from different contexts. However, I must certainly say here that scholarship does not lie in one or two corners of the world. That scholarship is global, and I'm absolutely speaking with complete respect for scholarship that comes from anywhere. But the categorization of reality, the way the categories we use to understand social reality, let's say, has to also be contextualized. Otherwise, we are not able to relate what is happening on the ground with those abstract categorizations that we learn in theories and so on. So the lived experiences of students have to be made part of curriculum. And therefore, I mean, Sharmila Rege's work is famous over here, the Phule Ambedkarite feminist pedagogies. Unfortunately, she's no more with us. But one of those sociologists who has flagged this issue now and again and has actually done some concrete work in the University of Pune in the Center for Women's Studies. And there's been research done on the pedagogies used by her, which is also been written about as research papers. Having flagged that issue in terms of diversity, I would like to actually focus a little bit here and take a position on how policy itself is actually failing us. You know, as individual academics in our own institutions, I think we are trying very hard to somehow see how diversity becomes important in our classrooms. But Rohit Vemula is one example, and there are several of them, that show how students from different backgrounds are actually continually marginalized within higher education institutions, and of course school education. There is umpteen numbers of researches on that. So how is policy failing us? Let's look at the new education policy draft of 2019. They have used the term underrepresented groups, and everybody is under that group. Women, lower castes, SC, ST, economically marginalized, minorities. That's 2/3 of India. 2/3 of India has been put in the basket of underrepresented groups in the new education policy draft. And we are talking of diversity. The policy talks of special education zones for URGs. So we are talking of segregation right at the beginning. The policy talks of differentiated curriculum for people who live in urban poor areas so that they know how to live there. So that curriculum includes issues of drug abuse, issues of sexuality, issues of how do you cope with poor drinking water. I mean, the policy seems to suggest that actually these so-called underrepresented groups need a different kind of education. And we need to, this reminds me of segregated education in apartheid South Africa, or even the blacks in the US for a long, long time. So we are moving in that direction, and we are talking here of very important issues, how we need to make our institutions inclusive. How do we make them inclusive if the policy is directing us to do completely, different things? I'd just like to also flag a couple of things which essentially tell us that the new policy thinking is really one of governance. It's a model of governance. It doesn't necessarily give us the autonomy, the rhetoric of which is there in policy. So you will find rhetoric of equitable public education at all levels. You will find the rhetoric of looking at the marginalized, looking at diverse. All of that is there. That kind of co-option of that discourse is there. But when you read in between the lines, and if you read the last chapter, which is chapter number 23rd, which talks of a governance model where you have a Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, that is the apex body, and the head of that is the Prime Minister himself. He just announced that he'll be a bridge to anybody who wants to invest in India. He will look after businesses, he will look after school education, he will look after higher education. He can do everything. He's omnipresent. He's probably superhuman. I don't understand this. The 23rd chapter talks of a Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, headed by the Prime Minister, which will subsume under it all the bodies that exist today, AICTE, NCTE, UGC, every single, so all of higher education and school education is going to come under a single governance model. So what I see happening is that the policy perspective and structure, which actually gives a new architecture to higher education, is not about diversity but about exclusion. It's actually saying things like there will be teaching universities, there will be research universities, and there will be autonomous colleges. And there will be no affiliated colleges. So let us all get isolated. Now, which academic in the world will recommend that teaching and research ought to be separate? Which academic, I want to know? Because unless an academic who engages in research and teaches at the first year of an undergraduate program, there is going to be no disciplinary growth. And we all know that. Some of the best academics of the world, whether they are in the US Ivy League universities or whether they are in other parts of the world, They actually teach undergraduate courses because that's how disciplinary growth happens. And of course, the intersections of discipline, the need of the hour is to bring in inter and transdisciplinary kind of development. I think the question of diversity and inclusion, therefore, needs to be flagged as certainly an issue of content, curriculum content and pedagogy, specifically in terms of contextualizing that content and enabling not just good scholarship in books and covers of books, but to relate that to the lived experiences of our students who come in. And the second would be to enable access, not just in terms of numbers, in terms of women coming in terms of lower castes coming in and the minorities, but in terms of social access. How do we ensure participation of them in learning? So it's through curriculum, it's through different pedagogic techniques, it's through support systems, support services for students. For example, materials. Curriculum materials are not available in the language. Today, Delhi University can say that we have close to 65% students, first generation higher education, who would like to learn in their language. But we do not have the materials. Neither do we have the skills and the repertoires as teachers to be able to engage, the point that just came up. Now that's a huge challenge. And how do we take, as the policy says, this percentage from 25% to 50%? You know, they're saying in 2050. How do we enable that? And of course, there's a huge problem at the school level, which I'm not going into right away because there isn't time for that. So I think these are some critical issues that we would have to look at in terms of diversity, understanding diversity, inclusion, because India is extremely complex. So when we talk of the identity of a person as a Muslim or a lower caste, remember, the identity is not singular, it is multiple. I mean, you know, I have an identity because of my language, because of my religion, because of the community I come from, and so many other aspects. So I just can't be singled out as a lower caste or an upper caste, but caste is at the center of our diversity. Thank you.
The Vice Chancellor would like to speak.
I just wanted to say that Professor Princey was supposed to join us. She's not feeling well and hence she's not here with us. But this diversity report that has been circulated, she pretty much authored it. So I would encourage you to read it. But I have other comments which I'll come back later.
Okay. Well, we're at the point where the conversation is actually becoming more heated and interesting, I believe. And we've got about 10 minutes, I think, till we have some questions, 10-15 for questions and answers. I would recommend people that have questions, we'll go one at a time. I'll just point at people if there's a rush, and you just got to find the closest microphone, I believe. Who has any questions first?
It's okay, you can.
Sorry. So just to introduce myself before I ask a question, my name is Aditya Malkani, and I am the South Asia representative for a body called the Association of Commonwealth Universities. We as the ACU have over 500 universities as our members across 50-odd Commonwealth countries, and the largest number of members are right here in India. So we have a lot of diversity within our network, and therefore this session has been of particular interest. It's a very simple, straightforward, pointed question, and it could be for any of the panelists, which is, how do you divorce the need for diversity from the political agenda of governments? And it's an open-ended question. It's as short and simple as that, but would be very interested to hear views.
Vice Chancellor, you would like to speak?
Yeah, I had well, thank you so much for the fascinating set of, panelists who made presentation in this session. What the fundamental question I have whenever we talk about diversity and inclusion is that is it possible to have a debate surrounding diversity and inclusion by not necessarily undermining our efforts to promote, let's say, excellence in any form and manifestation? Because inevitably, whenever we talk about diversity and inclusion, there are arguments that undermine merit, and we are all the time, and universities in particular, we are all the time grappling with this challenge. And I mean, we talk about this group here. All of us are elitist. We have studied in elitist institutions. We are working in elitist institutions, and to a large extent, we are privileged. So then the question is, with all the privileges that we have, and we also obviously have a sense of conscience, recognizing that with the privileges comes responsibility, and we need to recognize that we need to ensure to a large extent diversity within that privileges. So my question to the panelists is, this is a very difficult task that we are expected to undertake, and it's not, if we as academics are finding it difficult to undertake, then you can imagine how, let's say, governments which are far more interested in the next elections and are looking at, reasons to, let's say, position themselves for various political ends, how much difficult it will be from a public policy standpoint. So I would like, the panel to throw some light on the fact that this is a complex problem, and we run the risk, if we don't handle this in a more nuanced manner, it is so easy to, undermine and pretty much dismiss any effort to build institutions that are promoting excellence.
So I think add to this. So in my opinion, when we talk about diversity in the campus, it's not to perpetuate the prejudices. The diversity will come just to see that students coming from different backgrounds, and different backgrounds means they will have maybe different ways of learning. And that also is somewhat important, because there's only one way of learning, and peer interaction will help in argumentation on any particular subject, and that increases the excellence in students. For example, in social sciences, some of the best scholars in this country come from JGU, right? To respect to other universities like JGU. Let's say use the JGU as one of the examples. So why is that JGU has excelled so well, right, and compared to other universities in this country? And JNU has actually used the diversity in a very positive way in academic excellence, rather than encouraging the biases, right? Idea is you bring in the diversity and use the diversity to for excellence in education, but at the same time reduce the bias in the society. I think this is what the balance one has to do it, and I think what some of the suggestions that came about openly discussing certain things, and because I guess all of us, whether we even let's say take some subject which is completely away from the societal issues like physics, right, particle physics. If I want to study particle physics or molecular biology kind of a thing that I follow, I mean, to some extent, how do we even study those topics from different students? How they study? Actually, there's something to learn about it. That from that gives you an idea for pedagogy, which will help us in increasing the learning outcomes. So in a way, if our goal is to excel in education and make the university so-called world class, I think the diversity also helps.
Yes, you may.
Can I join in now? Okay?
Sure.
Okay, my name is Paul Flather. I spoke at a previous session. I actually wanted to make the same point that Raj made, and I think this is a terribly important point. It's a huge tension And we simply can't escape the tension by being platitudinous about it. Because what we'd like is to have excellent universities with maximum diversity. Okay, that's what we'd like. But it ain't easy. It ain't going to happen. And it may be that by definition it can't happen. Because actually, if all diverse students were excellent, we'd take them anyway. And there wouldn't be a problem. I just want to illustrate by 2 teaching experiences that I've had in my life recently. Last December, I was invited to teach in the Amazon jungle at a new university in Pucallpa called the University of the Amazon. And it was set up to teach the indigenous Quechua-speaking Amazonians, none of whom had been to university. So you can imagine that, but it was important, it was felt important to set up this university, it was by a former student of mine, to give them the experience of what higher education was possible and what it could offer. Now, they were so disadvantaged that they didn't know really what an essay was. And so each student was given a mentor. They came to classes and they talked about it, and then they were sat with their mentor to read and help to write the essays. So this was an extreme form of giving access to a very excluded group. And I would say that was an excellent university. But it wasn't a university of excellence. At Oxford, a university of excellence, we're being hugely criticised over the last 50 years, perhaps longer, for not being inclusive enough. And we've strived very hard within maintaining the principle of excellence to widen our boundaries. And we've done it through heavy outreach work, successful students going to schools which hadn't sent youngsters to Oxford, huge program of access building. We've done it through summer schools. I was involved in setting up the first summer schools to give people the chance to actually spend time at Oxford and see that it isn't an alien, unusual culture. People are normal, you can apply and you can succeed. And more recently, they've set up a program of foundation courses to get people in 1 year early, so to speak, so that they're prepared for taking the proper degree. All these are good ideas, and they have helped reduce the number of private educated students at the university. Oxford still remains a university of excellence, though. And what's good news for our debate is that the outcome results of these students have not lowered the total results. Though on merit, we have to admit that people won't do this, but we're off duty here and we're amongst friends, that when people enter, we're not measuring them exactly on the same way that we're measuring the more able students. We're looking for potential, we're doing our best, we're looking at their futures, and it's an imperfect science. So maybe, we've really got to grapple with this. I think I'm supporting Raj in saying this is a big issue, it's not easy to solve. What you just said, Professor, obviously is very helpful, and what everybody has said is helpful. But maybe we need to recognize universities of excellence can add things, but they can also be excellent universities which are preparing on diversity.
Okay, I'm going to ask Professor Batra to respond to that.
Okay, I think this certainly requires a long sort of discussion, but for the moment, briefly, I would say that we do need to perhaps also unpackage what we mean by excellence, and because there has been enough excellent writing on the link between quality and privilege and how we define our education in the framework of privilege. So perhaps we need to revisit a lot of these ideas. And JNU, I completely agree with you, is actually, and I'm an alumna of JNU, an excellent example of diversity and excellence. The government of India has tried many ways to completely dismiss JNU, but the point is it still comes in the first of the rankings. They have used excellent methods of bringing in people from potentially with excellence from really remote corners of this country, and they've done so well. Also, not having rigid methods of inclusion. For example, if you don't have a BSc degree, you can't do an MSc. So they'll allow an engineer to come and do sociology, things like that. And I think any university will have to accept the fact that the entire populace of that university can't become, the first 10. So there will be excellence along with diversity and along with diversity of potential. This is society. We must accept the fact that our universities are part of society. But yes, why do we have to look at excellence as in tension with, diversity? I think diversity helps us to move towards excellence. It's the tension is between quantity and quality that we can try and resolve in some way.
So, if I could just jump in for a minute, and I'll make it brief and we can follow up. I disagree with everything you said, because I do, and I think it's the same point put another way, which is you assumed away all the problem on the entry of what the barriers were, what excellence was at that point, not the long-term outcome, not the potential, not what the pathways might look like. And it may be that the resources are infinite to open those pathways enough, but I know what we're doing now is spending much more time in high schools and with K through 12 and early assessment. A lot of other universities are doing that too. And again, no one has the resources, but you must imagine, and if you have the resources, you would answer that question in a very different way. So since we're speaking among friends and off the record, beginning to end, I thought that was wrong.
But we are here now.
I would promise Professor Sabharwal, you could also respond to some of those questions, and then Professor Holland.
Thank you. We've already heard about how important teachers' role in promoting academic integration in the classroom is, and I would like to emphasize that, and especially investing time in knowing your students. That is important, as well as strengthening the confidence and protecting students from the stereotype threat that is, I think it's very relevant, and our study also shows that. And more specifically, I would want to point the attention to the administration. Administration of the university has a very important role to play, and especially in terms of empathy and how do we translate that into action is about equity in support, equity in help, student support. So that's really important, I think, and administration's role in promoting diversity and inclusion is paramount. Thank you.
One way in which some of the elite institutions in the United States have tried to create a balance between excellence and inclusion is by creating special academic programs for minority students. The most well-known are the Black Studies programs. But this effort, I think, has backfired on the institutions because most of them have a reputation for low academic standards, lack of rigor. The students are able to pass the courses and graduate with their bachelor's degree or master's degree without putting forth the same kind of effort as their colleagues in other majors. And then secondly, and maybe more insidiously, there are different standards for evaluating the faculty in these programs. So they're again not held to the same standards of quality in terms of research and publication. So I think most of these programs are under a cloud, and this has not been a successful effort to solve that problem.
But I'm sorry, but the Black Studies programs are not necessarily the same thing as remedial or college prep programs, right?
Yes.
There's quite a difference between those two, right?
And before we take any more questions, we still have a panelist who would like to respond to some of the questions. So, Professor Raymond, do you have it? Yeah. Sure. You can respond to the questions. We got one more question.
To some extent, I understand that this is a complex problem, and
And also I think that there are enough possibilities to address that complexity. For instance, had Rohit Bumala studied in Jindal, would Rajkumar had allowed him to commit suicide? So there are better ways. There are different people who make a big difference where you are and kinds of stuff about it. If one goes back, and I'd like to take you back to the big debate that took place in British Parliament in the early 19th century, when English was introduced, it was told that Indians can't speak English and all of that stuff about it. Now, all Indians speak, there are many Indians who speak as good or better English than most others. So it's a question of opportunities. So the challenges that we come across with respect to having a diverse class at higher education is largely because the institutions before higher education have not addressed that properly. If they address it prior to that, so then obviously it becomes naturally easy that you will not come across that as a challenge. In India, for instance, most neighborhoods with Dalit and marginalized groups, religious minority groups, public schools or government schools are highly neglected or non-existent. For instance, before 2006, most Indians, even the Indian state government used to believe that most Muslims go to madrasas. It's only after such a report came out, it turned out to be only 4% Muslims who go to madrasas. And there are a lot of students who drop out. One thing that came out from the Sachar report with Muslim families, since they can't sustain education, they drop out, which is why the scholarship scheme was introduced to address that particular problem. Then some governments, particularly Gujarat government, took the case to the Supreme Court that this is a violation of equal opportunities and all of that stuff about it. So I think a lot of these problems could be handled in that sense, because at the end we have to realize, when one looks at the contemporary politics, that if you are interested in building smart cities, you need to also build smart people. Right? You can't have smart cities without smart people. On the one hand, your government talks about diversity as our strength, then you are trying to talk about have a citizenship bill which excludes particular minorities. And you can't, so it's very important to have a public discourse which kind of challenges that kind of things. Thank you.
And do we still have a final question? I'm conscious that absolutely, yes.
Thank you. I don't want to, already the comment has been made on the question of excellence versus equitable access, so I'm not going to repeat that. But I just perhaps want to submit that perhaps it's also important to unpack the idea of privilege itself. It's also not privilege is also not a very unilinear thing. You can be privileged in one aspect and not so privileged in the other. So it cannot be that students who come into institutions like JGU, for example, from elite educational institutions, may be privileged in one aspect, but there could be other kinds of marginalization in terms of language, in terms of religion, in terms of the region they belong to, their sexual identities, questions of ability, disability, mental health. So it's not that, the question of privilege also needs to be unpacked, that's all I wanted to say. It's not a very unilinear understanding of privilege.
I don't know if you wanted to conclude or to extend the discussion on this point. I wanted to mention briefly, obviously, since we're relating our experiences of our home institutions, as you all know, Harvard is being sued by the Students for Fair Admissions, who are claiming that Harvard has discriminated against on the basis of race because of the effort to attract more and to admit more African Americans and Asian students are protesting. Harvard's reply is, we continue to vigorously defend the right of Harvard College and of every other college and university in the nation to seek educational benefits that come from bringing together a diverse group of students. So it's a tough question in U.S. constitutional law. It stems, of course, from the awareness that I feel very deeply about of affirmative action and how it's evolved in constitutional law. And I happened to be on the staff of UNESCO in 1978 when we drafted a declaration which is a product of therefore the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization on race and racial prejudice, which sought to confront the very concept of race as being contrary to our understanding of the unity of the human species, but to draw a number of policy conclusions, including the following. Where circumstances warrant, special programs should be undertaken to promote the advancement of disadvantaged groups and, in the case of nationals, to ensure their effective participation in the decision-making process. This is 1978, so the issue has, of course, been confronted. It's evolved since then, but I have the sense that we're backsliding a bit even. And so what has been alluded to a few times, and I think we need to underscore it, and I'll end with that, is that the experience with special outreach to communities of underrepresented minorities, of special college preparatory programs from them, and of coaching while they are there, can bridge that gap between their inadequate preparation, but their certain adequacy in more ways than one to contribute to the diversity of the institution and to lead fulfilling lives as well-educated people. So I'm deeply moved by this question because it has to do with the last 40 years of my career, and we're still trying to live up to the Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice of 1978. 78, yeah.
When we talk about excellence and access, we should recognize that out of that Harvard litigation, what was already well understood has become crystal clear, which is the massive advantage that is given to children of alumni and to donors. The massive advantage. And the numbers are stunning, and it wasn't a surprise, but the scale is. And so if you're talking about one side of this coin, you better recognize the other.
And the recent scandals, no question about it.
The scandals highlighted
the fact of, I agree, we're on the same side on this one. Completely on the same side of this one.
But when we talk about excellence and access, these multiple windows, I think, give us some real pause about where we are and how we got here and how we might do something else. And Harvard becomes an illustration of that.
Okay, our most patient
Yes.
Yeah, so Professor Flatter, when you said about the Amazonian University, I was just wondering, like we were discussing this, when you said that you wanted to adapt or you wanted to train these children to take essay tests or write essays, why not devise a new method where they can be judged in different ways based on whatever their ways of learning are? Would that be really difficult, or it would be new, but wouldn't that be worth it?
Listen,
I just gave a snapshot. It's a huge story. I just wanted to show you that there's different ways of tackling this problem. I think we're all on the same side actually. We want to get to a situation where you can have excellence and diversity in all institutions. But in some cases you start at one end, in other cases you start at the other. So you can take diversity to excellence, and you can take excellence to diversity. That's my point. That it's a question of blurring and different strategies to get to the same point.
So Mujibur, my point is, see, in a way, University of Hyderabad, in my view, is very privileged. JGU is hugely privileged. These are all institutionally privileged because they are all hugely, we know the privileges. My concern is not about that. My concern is, how do we deal with the Indian scenario where, with 1,000 universities and 40,000 colleges, we have created a large, mediocre higher education sector? One. Second, the joblessness that is emerging out of university graduates. I can give you thousands of statistics. Every state government announces jobs for 25 office attendants. Over 1 lakh of people apply, of which 5,000 PhD holders, thousands of master's degree holders, not from fake universities, legitimate, legally established, credible universities. So the point of excellence which I raised was about the mediocrity that is institutionally embedded across the large number of institutions, and let us not fall into the risk of using diversity and inclusion as a bogey to compromise on our effort to ensure excellence in those institutions.
Solutions of those lie, because there are universities in this country, and Delhi University is an example. We have 40% vacancies. So mediocrity is because nothing is happening in the university. universities. That's also a reason. So we must understand where the structural issues are, which has contributed to this kind of mediocrity. I completely agree with you. But it's not the tension between diversity and excellence. That's what I feel.
Okay, well, I want to say, so I want to say two things. One, there is a reception waiting for all of you. I would like to invite you to my home here on campus, where we'll have the reception. And you also have to go through another speech, which is by Professor Dinesh Singh, the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Delhi. So I think we will continue this conversation. It's a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to the chair in particular for navigating this session. Thank you.
We're not done yet.